Welcome also to this final session of finding a sustainable transition path to zero net carbon emissions for New Zealand. Once again, I want to acknowledge the Wise Response Society. You all have links to the Wise Response Society through the presentations that we've seen and are now on our website, and I'd encourage you to look at their website and follow the wide range of material that's available there. And I acknowledge them particularly, and Alan Mark in particular, for setting up the course and for, I don't think, as I've said here, to strong-arm members of his committee to present to us as they have over the last 5 weeks. And in that regard, it's my very great pleasure to welcome and to introduce to you Associate Professor Lisa Ellis. Lisa is Director of the Philosophy, Politics, Economics program in the Department of Philosophy. She has a BA from Princeton and an MA and PhD from Berkeley. Lisa is currently political theory field editor for the Journal of Politics. She's associate editor for Blackwell's Encyclopedia of Political Thought, and she's a curator for the December 2020 issue of the Australasian Philosophical Review. Lisa has written several political texts. She's also at present writing about the collective ethics of flying with a couple of her colleagues here at Otago, the human value of biodiversity loss, and the principled distribution of the risk of sea level rise. I can't imagine anyone better qualified to talk about the ethical issues raised by climate change and policy options for mitigation and adaptation. Please welcome Lisa Ellis.
Thank you, Doug. Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad to see you here. I'm really happy to hear about how the previous weeks have gone. It hasn't always been pleasant, but I think it has always been important and good. We're going to see what we conclude today. So I'm going to talk a bit about the ethics connected with climate change, and I'm going to invite you to think through with me how you connect to the ethical relationships that we're building and we have built through our climate change behavior. So if we think about the world today, there are a couple of things about the status quo that really should bother us. When we think about the way we're distributing, for example, the remaining carbon budget, which I know that you all have already learned about from my colleagues, New Zealanders are taking far more than their fair share of the remaining carbon budget. And we didn't ask permission of anybody else in the world. We have just done this. We're certainly not alone in doing this. There are other countries that are also doing this. Generally speaking, it's the advanced industrial democracies that are taking more than their fair share of the global carbon budget. And this is what we call, in my field, an intra-generational wrong. That means there isn't any temporal aspect to it. We're being unfair to people that we're sharing the planet with today. And that last phrase I used is actually going to be really important for our thinking today. We want to think about how we can set ourselves in right moral relations with absolutely everybody that we might interact with. I'll be bringing that up again in a minute. So it's my view that one of the reasons New Zealanders tolerate this obvious wrong that we're doing the rest of the world is that it's relatively invisible. I haven't found in the 5 years I've been living in this country that New Zealanders are relatively unethical. In fact, I found very much the opposite. Right? As you may have noticed, New Zealanders in the world are able to take strong and costly ethical stances and stand up to the big bullies of injustice in the world. And so it's surprising when you see us, for example, rated by the International NGO Climate Action Tracker as inadequate. You might say, why are we not leaders in this obviously ethical area? And I think one of the main reasons is that the fact of the injustice we're doing to the rest of the world is invisible to us. Otherwise, we'd be likely to act on it. There's another aspect of the immorality of the status quo with regard to the distribution of the remaining carbon budget. And that has a temporal dimension. We are basically shifting the burden of this problem onto future generations. It would be difficult to sort of tot up the pluses and minuses of the utility that the present generation has bequeathed to the world and denied the world, and I'm not interested in doing that today. I suppose you should mention along the way, we have, in terms of raw numbers in the context of incredible population growth worldwide, there are fewer people in absolute poverty today than there were 20 years ago. This is something I think every citizen of the planet should be proud of. It's extraordinary that in the context of population growth, we've managed to reduce the absolute raw numbers of people who are suffering immediate hunger, for example. So it's not as if the generational utility that we've bequeathed the world is negative. But if you just look at the problems associated with the carbon budget, we are transferring this problem to future generations. And it's actually even worse than that because it's much less costly to act now to transition to clean energy, to adapt to the changes that we've already locked in. It's much less costly to act now than act later. So we're not just transferring the burden to future generations, we're transferring a bigger burden than it would be if we picked it up. So how is this possible for a group of people who are manifestly of goodwill? The problem, as I see it, again, is one of invisibility. So if you're trying to think about acting in the world, I was cowed by the weather today. I don't know if you guys were. I had to dry off my cat before I left. Right? So I had been planning on walking, but I didn't walk. I fired up my Honda Jazz, and I emitted greenhouse gases on the way here. And I imagine that I'm not the only person who made that choice, right? When I did that, I accidentally impacted on the well-being of current people. For example, people who are living on low-lying Pacific islands. These people are already having to relocate, losing their traditional subsistence rights, for example. And I had an effect on people who have not yet been born. I had an effect on people who are going to suffer from increasing severity of weather, increasing drought, people who live on the coasts. I affected all of them. But the world that we are in today is such that it is very difficult, if not impossible, for me to set myself on a right moral footing with these people, right? And that gives me a sense of disempowerment and unease that I hope you guys are beginning to see maybe you can relate to. There's something wrong with the structure of our society if it's not possible for me through my actions to know how to treat everybody else rightly. I want to do right by everyone. In fact, it's an essential element of my freedom that when I step out and act, I'm not accidentally injuring people. That's why we have the rule of law, but it's missing in this area. And it makes us all feel uncomfortable because we know we have goodwill and we don't want to injure people with our everyday behavior. And we expect the society to provide us with a structure that allows us to act without accidentally harming people who we haven't even met. But the society is not doing that at present. The basic message for today is going to be that it is entirely within our power to set ourselves on a right moral footing with the rest of the world. My favorite philosopher is Immanuel Kant, a relative oldster, but still a goodie. And he used to describe the world as what he called a globus terraqueus. He said, we're on a watery sphere, and it is impossible for us to act in a way that is limited. Everything we do affects everybody else. So we have to figure out a way for us to arrange our relationships such that we're treating everybody on Earth fairly, right? How can we do that? I want to show you today, I hope you buy it, that it is entirely within our power to switch to an ethical social policy such that we're not accidentally injuring people. I talked a minute ago about firing up my Honda Jazz and showing up here. I think the right analogy for that, what a better social structure would make visible to me, if I went to, I don't know, Tuvalu, or I went to PNG, or I went to Fiji, or I went to Samoa, and I brought a digger, and I dug myself up a couple of square meters of beach and took it home, I don't think anybody would have any trouble suing me for damage. Right? I've stolen property. That's not right. And we have a system to deal with that. Effectively, with our current emissions behavior, all of us are doing this. Right? We're accidentally damaging people in the same way. We're removing their prospects for flourishing. There was an interesting lawsuit by the Inuit Circumpolar Council a few years ago, led by Sheila Watt-Cloutier, who's an amazing activist. So the Inuit Circumpolar Council noticed that the permafrost was melting. They noticed this far earlier than the rest of us. And their way of life was damaged. It wasn't possible for them to continue their traditional subsistence activities. And they sued the entire United States for removing their capacity to live their traditional way of life. They lost, but the fact that the lawsuit got as far as it did, I think, was encouraging. It's that kind of logic that I think we should be worried about. How can we make sure that we couldn't rightly be sued for accidentally ruining the prospects of other people we haven't even met? I also think we should think about adaptation here in New Zealand. Right? The wrongs that we're accidentally doing people by our emitting behavior are not limited to those who live on low-lying Pacific atolls or subsistence farmers in Bangladesh. These wrongs are right in our backyard. You guys know what this is a picture of? South Dunedin, in what year? Yeah, yep. Not too pleasant, right? Right? If I own property in this place, maybe I've had it for a couple of generations, right? It is manifestly not my fault that the property is decreasingly sustainable. I've behaved by the rules. I've done exactly what I always should have done. I've conformed to the societal rules as they're presented to me. I ought to be able to stand out in public and say, I've done everything I should, I'm a good person. But instead, there's an extraordinary burden of risk being transferred to people who are unlucky enough to have low-lying property in South Dunedin. Through no extraordinary fault of their own, they were doing absolutely typical, maybe even below typical emissions for members of an advanced industrial democracy. They happen to have inherited an excessive burden of risk. So our status quo policy in New Zealand right now is a transfer of risk, and it's usually a transfer of risk from the least vulnerable, right? People who own more sustainable property, people who don't happen to be in short-run danger, to those who are the most vulnerable, people who live in places like South Dunedin and don't have access to the capacity to things like lawyers or directly influence policymakers. In fact, with regard to adaptation, there are a couple of different kinds of policies that we can look at if we think about the status quo. So you guys probably don't know where this is. Anyone, any guess? It's Kapiti. There's no clues in the picture. Right? It's kind of unfair. Kapiti Coast. There's a big difference between the residents of the Kapiti Coast and South Dunedin, yes? That difference can be measured easily in terms of social vulnerability. And so when people who own property on the Kapiti Coast find themselves threatened by sea level rise, and in fact threatened by, from their perspective, by their own city council, which did a study and said some of these properties are at risk, and they added that risk in bright red letters to their land information memoranda, right? these relatively advantaged people were able to organize, get access to lawyers, and insist that the limb memoranda be changed. So where is risk being transferred in this case? It's not being transferred to the people who own the property like it is in South Dunedin. The risk in this case, now that the limb memoranda are blank, is being transferred to the potential buyers and to everybody else in New Zealand who's likely to have to cover any potential losses under the status quo. So again, it's being transferred from the least vulnerable to the most vulnerable. And I think in general, New Zealanders would not approve of these principles. The reason that we tolerate the status quo is not that we're bad people, it's that it's relatively invisible to us. So I would submit to you that right now, a good gloss on the status quo for adaptation in New Zealand is this one. Ooh, there it is. The rich get seawalls and the poor get moved. Ugh. Who would endorse this? Nobody. But we're not being asked because it's relatively invisible. You have to actually go out and look and see what is the policy doing about transfers of risk. And I think if you look at the status quo right now, we're in a situation where it's impossible for any of us to step out and be in right relation with our fellows. We have a situation of complete uncertainty. If you look at the history of government interaction in New Zealand, we tend to exhibit solidarity towards our fellow citizens in the case of natural disaster. And that's a really admirable thing about New Zealand, right? We don't endorse a sort of pure market, laissez-faire policy. We want to help each other. But if we don't have rules in place for something that's very different than a one-off earthquake, for something that's inevitable like sea level rise, then what we effectively have is an expectation that everyone is going to cover the risks of the few people that have coastal property. And this, again, is going to be a transfer from the most vulnerable, from the least vulnerable to the most in terms of risk. It seems unfair when you think about it. We shouldn't let it remain invisible. So what can we do about either the planetary status quo that I talked about a moment ago or the local status quo, both of which seem to put us in an unethical position? One thing I think you should absolutely take away from today and maybe from the last few weeks, to expect individuals to write this system on their own, that is crazy. It's also disempowering. It's a very effective way to make sure people don't advocate for change, to tell them that the status quo is the result of their personal consumer choices, and therefore, if they've ever driven or flown, they must approve of the current system. Now, when I put it that bluntly, you guys can see how bad an argument it is. This argument is incredibly common. As individuals, you should not feel responsible for the social circumstances that you inherited. You're not individually responsible, and only collectively can you make a difference to that. So think again about my choice to fire up my Honda Jazz and burn some fossil fuels to come here this morning. Right? I live in a social situation that you might describe as automobility. Right? We have all our infrastructure here in Dunedin arranged around personal fossil fuel-driven auto transport. Automobility, I submit to you, I bet you guys would agree, makes us fat, sick, and estranged from each other, right? Would any of us have willed this? No. And the fact that I fired up my Honda Jazz to get here this morning does not mean that I endorse automobility. But if, as an individual, the only thing that rejecting automobility would have got me this morning is I would have showed up cold, wet, and miserable, right? Because there was no other alternative. I'm not individually responsible for the status quo as we find it. This is something that we have to deal with collectively. So I'm just going to say a couple quick things about flying. If you're interested, we can talk about that later. I think flying is a very good example of this problem of the individualization of risk. Right, the airlines are very good, and they are organized internationally, and they're very good at that level also. The airlines are very good at saying, People want the current system, and they don't care about the effect on global climate change. Look how many people are flying. What they don't say is that people who take international flights are a tiny minority of the global population. Nobody knows what the percentage is because the airlines only count flights. They don't count individual flyers. But we're sure it's fewer than 10%. Right? So we're a very privileged number of people in the world, us especially, New Zealanders, right? Very privileged number of people in the world have grabbed a big chunk of the remaining carbon budget, and we use it to keep flying, and we haven't asked anybody's permission. And this seems like an ethical wrong. Right? If I go to the subsistence formula in Bangladesh and I say, you're not going to be able to bequeath your land to your sons because it's going to be totally inundated and covered with salt water. And the reason for this is that I really enjoy visiting my family in the US. Are you okay with that? Right? That's an ethically monstrous position, right? But that's not an accurate depiction of what the actual ethical structure is telling us. Because if I individually stop visiting my family, I'm going to bear all the costs of that transition on myself. My family will be sad, I will be sad, and I will not have affected the system of international air transport one iota. I've just been rendered weaker. In order for us to get out of our global excessive emissions, our local adaptation problems, or our global international transport conundrum, we have to work together. These things can only be changed collectively. And I would say the individual frame of it is a really good way to make people feel fearful and disempowered and unable to make a difference. So it's sort of doubly damaging. It's ethically inaccurate and it's politically disempowering. So what can we do better? Engaged processes just work better. I myself am really tired of hearing scientists at the IPCC say, we've given you all the facts, now it's time for political will. Right? Ban Ki-moon said this, they said it a couple of days ago with SR 15. The scientists say, we've given you the facts, let's have the political will. How do we know what the political will is? Was the political will represented by the Kyoto Accords, in which a few technocrats got together and tried to prescribe to the various countries of the world what they should do, and then the technocrats were surprised when people said, well, actually, that's not what we think we should do? No, that's certainly not the will of the world. You need information, and the World Historically Awesome IPCC has given it to us. And anybody who doesn't take it up is just allowing this great gift to lie unused. That would be nuts. So you need information. You do need political will, as I'll be talking about. People need to care. You also need effective institutions. So I complained about Kyoto just now. Paris is much, much better than Kyoto. We might be worried, we should be worried, that even if we do succeed at reducing our emissions as much as we promised we would in Paris, that it will not be enough. But the amount of activity following Paris compared to the amount of activity following Kyoto is extraordinary. How did this happen? Partly it was better information, partly it was political will, but I would submit the top-down aspect that had been chucked out and the bottom-up aspect that had been brought in made an enormous difference. Do you remember when countries made their own nationally determined contributions? This was a matter of great public discourse here in New Zealand and elsewhere. It makes it much more likely that we will change our behavior if we've been consulted about the new standards. I thought Chris Trotter today in the paper was especially eloquent on that point. Do not expect the masters of the universe to save you, right? We have to do this collectively ourselves. So I'm going to skip this. It's more about, it's really important to consult local people, otherwise you can't expect change. The sorts of things that we can do are mostly collective. We need to be expressive, we need to organize, we need to hold our politicians to account. This is hokey, but I think it's really important. having a nihilistic attitude toward our capacity to save a fruitfully habitable planet for future generations and every other living thing, that is not an optional attitude, in my view, for an ethical person. Right? If we go back to your sort of basic ethics, you want to be able to emerge in public and do other affecting action in a way that doesn't accidentally injure anyone. And that's what it means to be a free, ethical person. Right? I'm not willing to concede that that's impossible. That would be like willing to concede that moral humanity might well have not existed. I don't think that's an option. But I do think it would be silly not to be realistic about the challenges that we face. The comparisons are to the abolition of slavery and to the fight against Nazism. And those are some really powerful accomplishments. So we shouldn't be unrealistic about it. So I think that Antonio Gramsci's recommendation was the right one. We should have pessimism of the intellect, because we know it's hard, but it's an ethical requirement for us to maintain optimism of the will. And with that, I've actually stuck to my time, which for you is shocking. I never do that. But I really want to give you guys a chance to do an exercise before tea and report back on it. So here's what we're going to do for the next 20 minutes. We're going to break into 4 groups, and we are going to answer this question. And then at 10:45, each group is going to report back to the center. And I don't want to hear that we can't do anything, right? I really think now is the time for us to think about the sorts of things we can do that will really make a difference, because I think there are multiple interesting, legitimate answers to that question. So let me turn off my microphone, and I will help you organize into 4 groups, and we will do our work. We have 15 minutes to do it. Okay, let's start with Doug's group. What sorts of things did you guys come up with, large and small, that we can do? Oh, let me give you a mic.
The small things are things like buying locally, eating seasonally, using community gardens. A couple of people mentioned Generation Zero, and clearly for whatever reason have got onto their email. Generation Zero is a group of young people who have developed a plan called Adopt an MP. And the idea is that you get a small group of people together and focus on your local MP and endeavour to influence them by means of discussion and debate over the whole issue of sustainability. We also mentioned the fact that that's working at central government level, but that we should also be influencing local government level, city councils and regional councils. And one example is questioning and debating their policies and planning on subdivisions, in particular subdividing what is or has been productive land that I think Dougal talked about in his talk on sustainability through land use. And there was also mention made of afforestation for this reason. The need of the decision makers to reconsider the whole matter of the way we use and develop forests.
Thank you so much. That's great. It's lots of good ideas and not so comprehensive that we don't have lots of other things to say. Dougal, what did your group come up with? Oh, thank you, Alison.
I think our group got more into the sort of philosophical aspect of things. So we started off talking about the importance of individual action and responsibility, and maybe an individual at birth should get a carbon budget. And this was followed up by the thought of incentivising with taxes, which of course brings in mobilisation of community. So therefore, we went from individual to community, and then somebody remembered Community 73, when invited community groups came together to discuss issues, which was a very productive kind of forum. And that led us to think that if there is enough community will, political parties might find that it was advantageous to have a cross-party agreement on climate change.
Thank you so much. I love that individual carbon budget idea, although I worry about youthful profligacy. Edith, thank you.
Well, can you, oh yes, you can hear me. In our group, we talk example to fly less but for longer, having less flight, but when you go somewhere, you go to quite a few places for longer. And another suggestion was to use the online service to order, for example, grocery online. Then if there is 20 people that order online and it's delivered at home, it's 19 less car on the road, to get more political, and I think that's what other people have said, to suggest practical individual changes and talk to family and friends. And we talk about the deniers and how they might not be denying, but they don't want to accept not the truth, the science. And then to meet people where they are, morally and emotionally. Don't ask me to explain. More political, I think we already suggested that too. Yeah, that's what we see.
Oh, thank you very much.
Who is this?
Alan's group.
We ranged all the way from national political level to personal. I'll start with the national political level, where very strong agreement that there is a need in terms of national policies to get all of the major political parties agreeing to work together towards a goal. And we can see significant problems there because of the particular allegiances that parties have, like national to farming. And so long as that is an inherent obstacle, we've got a significant problem. Very strong feeling that collective approaches to local politicians rather than individual approaches were more likely to be productive. So groups of people going to talk to people like Michael Woodhouse is likely to be more effective than individuals approaching. Some of us have had very little success with individual approaches. At the other end of the spectrum, personal and family type things, encouraging more discussion within the groups that we live in and within our families to try and bring a greater degree of consensus about the urgency. And then at the middle level of the local community, things like my observation the other day when driving back from the airport at the stream of cars that were heading to the airport, and thinking back to when I first arrived in Dunedin, where most people went to the airport on a bus from the centre city. But that, of course, involved being driven down to the centre city to get on the bus, and either parking there or having someone drop you off and take the car back home. And the idea possibly that the use of shuttles is actually a pretty good, because you are picked up from your home and taken straight to the airport and vice versa. And maybe that could be promoted as a more effective energy strategy. One thing that I didn't get to mention to the group, but did strike me rather strongly. My daughter worked for National Geographic in Washington, DC for 4 years, and she reported the incredibly strong concern about climate change within the people working in that environment. And obviously the same is true in many scientific organisations in the United States. But that is totally being sidelined by the government there. It's very hard to get coherent national decision-making when there are strong lobby groups in different directions.
It's true, but I want to focus on what we can do, not what we can complain about. It's a legitimate complaint.
Well,
Yeah.
I have talked about what we can do right at the start, but I just say there are major pressures against it.
All right. That was really good work. I think this list is super encouraging. Some of these ideas I hadn't heard of, and I really like them. Now I'm going to release you all for tea.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll get underway. We have three of the current and past presenters here who will be happy to answer questions and discuss issues with you. The intention is that this be an open forum. We're using microphones, A, so that you can hear, and B, because it's being recorded for those who couldn't be here today to listen to it. We don't normally have a roving microphone for questions, but I'm roving mic overseer, and we'd ask anyone who has a question or a comment to make just to wait till I get there and use this microphone so that that's clear for everybody as well. That said, the floor is yours for questions, discussion, comment.
Thanks. I'd like to ask Alan how we can support the WISE response or be involved with it.
We don't have membership. Maybe we should. We have been discussing it. We're basically a Otago-based but New Zealand-wide society with a wide range of interests and concerns and activities, and we normally call on a range of experts appropriate to a particular issue to contribute, and we do have a good group of those, and that's the way we've operated. We did produce a petition to Parliament back in 2014, and for that we did canvass for support, and we got over 5,000, which was fairly modest in relation to a nationwide petition. But that's the only time we've actually canvassed individual support for a particular case, and that was the case we took to Parliament for our concern for a national risk assessment. And that was referred to the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee, which a year later heard us, and we had 4 people making the submission on behalf of the Society, and we had a lot of local Wellington supporters at the Select Committee in support of us, including Sir Geoffrey Palmer, who's our patron. So it is difficult. We've got a website which is very widespread, very comprehensive in terms of our activities. It goes right back to our initiation in 2013, and it's well organised, and you can easily interrogate that and find what's happening and respond to a particular issue if you so wish. and you get onto the website. You can Google it as www.wiseresponse, all one word, .co.nz, and that'll access the website for you. .org.nz. So that's probably the best way, unless we establish a membership.
There is Facebook also.
Pardon?
There's a Facebook site also.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you prefer Facebook. It's not as comprehensive as the website, but there'll be announcements.
So that's my suggestion at this stage. If we establish membership, it's much more workload for those of us at the operational centre, but we do have about 6 people in Dunedin that we call on regularly, and one of them is maintaining our website, Mark Jackson, and we're thinking of upgrading our website at this time, but that's certainly the best way of communicating with the organisation.
Just a comment, I'm pretty sure that more than one of the presentations that we've heard over the last 6 weeks has links to the Wise Response site as well. So if there is anyone who's still finding it difficult or is unable to access the PowerPoint presentations that you've seen through our website, please come and see me afterwards, and I'll explain the relatively simple means of tracking it down on the U3A's website.
Could I just add that if you get to the website, you can send an email to the website, and that it comes through to a couple of us, and if you say you want to join, we'll put you on one of the mail-out lists that we have, and you'll be connected then.
Great.
Yes, hello, my name's Tharma Greer, and I'm just an ordinary person who tries to do their best and minimise my impact on the environment. And I do think individual actions are important. But what I'd like to ask you is about the insurance industry, which, despite how many deniers we have in the world, is now seen to be influencing through their increased premiums on vulnerable areas. And it's very alarming to hear that in this country, people in the Wairarapa were somehow cleverly able to have removed from their LIM reports information that is critical to not only a home buyer, but I would have thought the insurance industry. So I just find that extraordinary. So I just want to clarify. So they were able to go to court and have factual information about the land removed.
Yes, of course, the long story is full of complicating detail. So they did go to court. It was determined that the quality of the scientific report that the council relied on was too low. And in fact, by today's standards, it was too low. For example, it didn't include uncertainty ranges. So rather than tell the council what to do, the judge recommended that the council revisit it. And at this point, the council just gave up because the sort of show of force had been made. That's why I think, and I think this is relevant to your individual ethics perspective, I think until there's central legal certainty about what council's responsibilities are with regard to risk, we will be in an immoral position with regard to each other. For example, your responsibility to inform future buyers of your property would depend on where you live. Your assumption of risk would vary according to the power of the ratepayers in your district. That's not a situation that anybody's going to endorse. And it's one of those things that really cannot be resolved on the local level, that we need more than just guidance from central government. We need legal certainty about that. And there's a case happening right now. It's not directly related to climate change, but it's directly related to this problem having to do with Matata. So they had a terrible debris flow in Matata, and at first the council thought that it would be safe for people to move back, and they did move back and they improved their properties, and then subsequently it was determined that it was a completely nutty thing to do to live below this debris flow, and that everybody's lives were at risk. And they're still now working out who bears what responsibility. This particular decision has been referred to a special commission because it's going to have implications. But one thing that I think hasn't been properly appreciated is the difference in scope between this case that's supposed to be an important guide for future responsibility distribution, which is Matata, which is only a few dozen properties, and the scale of these choices that we have to make about adaptation, which is tens of thousands of properties, 5 airports, enormous numbers of roads and rail lines, and there's just no comparison in terms of scale. So I don't think relying on the court judgment in Matata for guidance is going to be sufficient. I really think it has to be proactive parliamentary legal determination. But you're right, it's a terrible situation. If you were a property owner on Kapiti Coast, and by the way, after they removed the information from the limbs in this area, 1/3 of the property changed hands in the next 5 years, right? So if you were that owner, how could you act rightly? Right? You have responsibilities to your family as well as to the community and the future home buyers, and your neighbors aren't telling anybody anything. That's a moral position that no one should be put in, I think. I don't think we should go around blaming those people. I think we should try to make it more fair. Yeah.
Do you think that the insurance industry could be brought on side?
Yes, well, I think
because they must be worried watching the, the number of events going up year on year about their whole industry, and if they raise the annual costs, they're going to get less insurers. People are going to give up insuring.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if they couldn't be allies in this, and we should outreach to them.
Yeah. So listening to Tim Grafton, who represents the Insurance Council New Zealand, is really edifying. Of course, he represents the interests of the industry. He's not talking about the interests of all New Zealanders, but he has some really interesting and intelligent things to say about that. And the Insurance Council, I think rightly, says we need certainty from central government about the responsibility for the risks associated with this long-run, inevitable change that is sea level rise, not analogous to something like earthquakes. So there's been a proposal, which I think is really quite promising, made by 2 policy scholars who I happen to really admire, Jonathan Boston and Judy Lawrence. And they've written quite a nice little paper saying, we really need to think about pre-funding climate adaptation. We need to think about certainty about responsibility. And they say we should use the EQC as an analogy for what we should do moving forward. So it's both intertemporally and intergenerationally unfair, our status quo. And this is Boston and Lawrence talking, not me right now. Right now, we're not accumulating the resources that we're going to need to adapt to the scale of change that is coming in the next few decades, but we're also not sufficiently discouraging people from making risky coastal investments. And you can see why anybody would, right? If I'm betting, will the state bail me out? I happen to be a relatively powerful, relatively connected person who can buy expensive coastal property or maybe even develop an entire section of coastal property. I might make a bet that the state will bail me out if I undergo what looks like a natural disaster, even though it was predictable. Well, when I do that, I'm just behaving rationally in an unsettled legal climate. But effectively, what I'm doing is I'm saying, somebody who works 3 jobs as a cleaner, their tax money is going to make me whole. And I don't think most people would agree that that risk should be transferred to everybody. So with regard to the insurance industry in particular, one thing that's very frustrating for those of us who are working as researchers in this area is that for perfectly legitimate business reasons, they do not share their information, right? So they have really good information about where the risks are, and they're acting on those. But at the same time, they're calling on central government for certainty because everyone will be better off if we know who's responsible for what. And furthermore, the UK gave us a really good example of what you can do in this situation when the UK negotiated as a country with their insurers. And they set a red line, property after 2009, you are responsible for making risky decisions. And before 2009, if you're vulnerable, then they set up a private-public partnership where insurance companies were aided in making people whole. I think we need to do something like that. We need to listen to Boston and Lawrence.
All right, further questions? Yes.
Do we as a country have a goal of achieving zero emission by 2050?
Yes, the coalition government amended the commitment New Zealand made to the Paris Climate Summit by committing the country to zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So that is about to come into legislation. The zero carbon bill, which 15,000, more than 15,000 submissions were made, almost all in support, will be promulgated, I think, in April next year. It's being introduced to the House, I think, in 10 days or so, and will be debated in the House until the bill is passed. The coalition government has the numbers to pass the bill, but James Shaw, as Minister of Climate Change, has emphasised the absolute critical importance of having a cross-party support for this bill. Because despite those number of submissions in support of the bill, and despite 60 major industries and businesses responsible for some 50% of our current greenhouse gas emissions forming a coalition in support of this legislation to address the problem, have also emphasised the critical importance of cross-party support so that industry and business have confidence that they're not going to be retracking, readjusting their situation with the next election or whenever there's a change of government. They need absolute certainty that whatever they are asked to change in terms of responding to this issue is going to be there for the indefinite future. So that's really critical. And I'm just thinking that, you people, many of you probably feeling, what can I do? Having heard the issues, accepting its seriousness, just what can I do? Well, I suggest two things. One, a letter to the editor in the ODT in support of the recent reports that have come out emphasising the critical issue of greenhouse gas emissions and the urgency of addressing it, which has come out and reinforced in the recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has been getting considerable publicity lately. So indicating that you've been to this course, you've heard 6 speakers addressing the various aspects of the issue, and you would like to add your support for government addressing the issue. I mentioned earlier that John Cox, who was Chair of Sustainable Dunedin City, and I, December last year, visited Michael Woodhouse and discussed the importance at that stage of cross-party support, which we were asked to do on behalf of Gen Zero, the youth group, which we did, and got some indication of endorsement from Michael Woodhouse, but he wouldn't commit himself. We've been asked again by Gen Zero to particularly visit Mr. Woodhouse, the Honourable Michael Woodhouse, given his position in the National Party and the critical importance of National supporting this legislation. So I've again written to Michael Woodhouse and asked for a meeting with him and John Cox. But I've just thought today it would be very good to have this meeting, this group, represented when we visit Michael Wood House. And I've discussed with Doug Holborough, who's organised this and been to all the talks and heard the discussion, would perhaps come along with John and I and visit Michael Wood House, and he could pass on the commitment, the concern of this group. So perhaps a resolution, somebody put a resolution from the group to say you would support and endorse Doug Holborough coming to represent the concerns of this group when we visit Michael Wood House. I think would be very helpful and give you some feeling of achieving something with your concerns to put it vested in Doug to carry your concerns and express them as your group to Michael Wood House, assuming we'll meet him in the near future. So do we have anybody that's willing to put a resolution of support for Doug to represent the concerns of this group? Well, we'll put the resolution after we get a motion. Thank you. Your name? And do we have a seconder?
Should I be taking? I'll
Yeah,
take
please
these.
do.
Yeah.
Should you write down the...
Yeah, I just got to get back. It'll take me a minute technically.
Perhaps, I just, while she's doing that, I'd just say the zero carbon bill will go through a select committee process, won't it? So that's an opportunity for everyone in New Zealand, hopefully everyone, to submit. Anyone who wants to can submit on that. So it's another way you can do something. The question is there a plan? It's all very well to have a goal, but is there a plan to get there for New Zealand? The bill, once it becomes an act, will, as it's proposed now, will put in place a climate change commission, selected group of perhaps 10 experts, and they will come up with recommendations for Parliament, as I understand it, for Parliament, on how to get to that goal. So the Act will have the goal in it, and it will set up the Commission, and it will instruct the Commission to come up with the plan you're asking for. And it will, again, I anticipate, will be staged. It'll be that wedge diagram I showed you, and there'll be budgets and probably some form of ETS, some form of trading scheme where people can share the emissions.
Yeah, I'd add to that. Currently, the government has set up an interim climate change committee to prepare for the Commission the issues that they will confront. And I don't know all of the names on that committee, but Dr. Jan Wright, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, recently retired, is a member of that committee. And Keith Turner, who was General Manager of Meridian Energy as an energy expert, people from agriculture, people from industry. So it's already a representative group, but significantly it doesn't have a climate science expert on it at this stage. And we've been advising, recommending that there's certainly a climate change expert on the Commission. So government is in action. They're committed, I think, to changes. The issue is urgent, and the delays of the political process instills some concern. But it's been assessed by competent scientists that we'll need 6% per annum reduction in greenhouse gas emissions to meet the zero carbon commitment of 2050 if we're going to achieve that. So the situation is urgent. 6% reduction per annum starting from now. So we've had a motion and seconded that this group would request Doug Holborough to represent their concerns in a presentation to the Honourable Michael Woodhouse, local National Party Member of Parliament.
I'm very much in
I
doubt
can't
of
figure out
this.
how to display it.
Very much in doubt of it. Mostly for the reason that I don't think U3A, because this is a group of U3A members, this is a motion which will be seen as a U3A. It will be if it comes from this group. It will come like that. And I don't see U3A as an organisation to take a position to this extent on any matter. The opportunity's been given, and what was suggested here, that Wise Response and organisations like that are the place to bulk up thoughts and submissions and memberships on this issue, and I think that would be of much, much more value than an out of left field from a learning group as opposed to a group with individuals with commitments to this cause. I don't think this is the place for it.
I'll respond to that if I can, Alan. The board of U3A has a very clear policy on this matter. Any issue where the name U3A Dunedin is being used has to have the approval of the board. And so quite clearly, my representing this group cannot be shown as representing the views of U3A, and that's not the intention, as I understand it, of what Alan is suggesting. Alan has very carefully said this group, meaning the people in this room. It happens to be a U3A gathering, but there is no reason at all, in my view, why the individuals in this room should not nominate a representative of the individuals in this room to put a particular point of view to a member of Parliament. That's what's being suggested. That I do not hesitate to point out is what you'll be voting on when you vote for this resolution. I will not represent U3A Dunedin. I'll be representing you as a group of concerned individuals. My view is that is exactly the kind of action that we've been talking about all morning. What can I as an individual do? Well, this is one thing that you as individuals can do, but as a group, I'll leave it at that.
Let me interrupt for a minute.
I could add from Wise Response, we are active in the issue, and I think your contribution to that would not make a significant difference. We've made a comprehensive submission on the zero carbon bill, and we have been talking with individuals involved with it, and rest assured, we are doing everything in our power to promote this exercise.
I'd just like to ask, now that we have the tech working, Thelma, how close am I to what your original proposal was? Could you correct this for me?
I'm sorry.
It sounds like I shouldn't have written U3A, but I don't know what you exactly meant. Does that accurately? So Thelma, you say a group of Dunedin citizens. Thanks. I don't want to interfere with conversation. You guys should still discuss this. This is a significant action if you choose to take it.
Could I just suggest something? I think the zero carbon bill will happen, and I think the National Party's supporting that. The question is, I think the really important thing is that there's a goal, that there's a unified agreement around a goal that will achieve zero net carbon by 2050. And I would suggest that that's in there somewhere, otherwise... oh, yeah, well, do I...
Oh, I don't see any difficulty about explaining to Michael Woodhouse why the group has got together. It's the result of a U3A Dunedin course. But we make it perfectly clear that we are not representing the views of U3A Dunedin. We're representing the views of a group of citizens who've been at a course and discussed and heard the issues.
Yeah, we'll put the motion, and if there's an abstention or more, we will record that. The Zero Carbon Act, when promulgated, should set the program to achieve that. A lesser reduction per annum would probably take us to a 2 degree or more degrees Celsius increase beyond the industrial, or over the industrial period. So the 6% reduction per annum in greenhouse gas emissions is the target needed to achieve a 1.5 increase in global temperatures since the Industrial Revolution. And that's considered by the experts to be, and by the Paris Conference, Paris Climate Summit, to be the target the globe should set to avoid the worst effects of global warming and climate disruption, both of which we're currently experiencing.
Let me just add, I think I can answer your question real quick, and then I want to hear your second question. So you want to know how it would happen, and the present government envisions using a strengthened emission trading system. There are good reasons to be doubtful about the effectiveness of an ETS, but the one they're proposing is more functional looking than the last one. It's not as functional as a carbon charge would be, but that's what the current government is proposing. Now you have a second question. I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, I was just concerned, what specifically, is there a proposal to put some restrictions on the use of cars or number of...
The idea is to use the market, right? When things are more important, we demand less, when they're more expensive, we demand less of them. So if you have a ETS distributing permits to emit, that's going to raise the price of high emission behavior. It's going to be relatively more attractive to emit less. So if I'm making a decision, do I build a coal-fired boiler to dry my milk powder under a world in which it's more expensive, I might make a more rational decision. I believe that's what the government is, those are the methods that the present government is envisioning.
It's an average value, an average of 6% a year. It doesn't have to be 6% every year, but an average of 6%. So, change of road transport to rail transport, public transport increase, cycleways. I mean, they're already into initiating some of these new policies, and more will come with the support of government, or at least hopefully of government and Parliament. That's what we're asking, and that's what the Climate Zero Carbon Act will require, and the Climate Change Commission, when established under the Act, will be responsible for advising government on.
Polly.
My particular question is what do we do about the unethical effects of allowing the market to dictate how we do this sort of thing? Inevitably, those who have less are going to be those who can least afford. I think that's a really important
it is really important
to raise, and I wondered if anybody has any suggestions.
Well, I mean, it's a question for democratic decision, right? If we're unhappy with the way the market treats people now, then we invent policies. For example, we have beneficiaries receiving support now, and that's remediating market outcomes. And I don't think it would be any different going forward. You might not like it, but the way to address market inequality is through political action. That's my Gramsci, right? It sure is. I think we have to keep trying anyway. I think if you guys are, I know you do. I think if we're going to do this, we should do it. But that can't come from me. I'm going to hand over to Doug.
Can I say before we run out of time and get off the point of the resolution, I'll put that resolution. All in favour will say aye, and the contrary will say no, and we have one abstention. Do we have recorded as one abstention? Any other abstentions? The motion is passed. Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think it's fitting that we've left the last word to Sir Alan Mark as the wise response driver and the driver of this course. It's been a remarkable course, I think, for a number of reasons. Never mind the technology which we've tested particularly today. I can't recall a U3A course that has ended with quite such a vigorous discussion as we've had today, and with an outcome that ensures some ongoing activity. And that reminds me that I did take the names of 5 or 6 people, I think last week or the week before, in relation to setting up one of our discussion groups on sustainability. That's in train. There'll be some publicity about that from our discussion group's convener. And I think probably the best outcome, the best way you can thank these 3 and their colleagues is not by applause today, but by what you do from now on in relation to individual action and in relation to group action with regard to the sustainable transition path that we've debated. And nonetheless, like me, I'm sure you'll want to say thank you, and we do that most sincerely.